we live in a performance-driven world. Performance-driven world. A world where our value is exhaustingly tied to our performance. We are constantly being told what to do and who to become and how to change so that our lives can be better, so that we can be better. And I'm absolutely convinced, and have been for quite some time, that we desperately need relief from that kind of pressure, from that kind of performanceism. We need relief. So when Sunday mornings at church become one more venue for performance evaluation, can you blame a person for wanting to stay at home? Okay. When we are given performance treadmill instructions out there all week long, wherever we look, wherever we turn, and then we gather in church on Sunday mornings and we get performance treadmill instructions here also, well, no wonder that people are choosing to stay home. People are going, well, why would I go? I'm exhausted. What I need to hear is, it is finished, not just do it. I think it's important, as I mentioned last week, and I do this at the beginning of every year, to remind you and to remind myself of who we are as a church, what the sanctuary is, what we believe, why we believe it, why we exist, those sorts of things. Our mission statement, which is on the wall out there, simply says that the sanctuary exists. It's a place where God's boundless love meets a broken world. That's in the simplest way to define who we are. That's what we're about. We're a place where God's boundless love meets a broken world. I've titled this series, which started last week and ends this week, Misfits. Last week was Misfits Part 1. This week is Misfits Part 2. But I chose that title because I have felt for my entire life, I turned 50 this summer, so for 50 years, I have felt like a square peg in a world of round holes my entire life. My whole life. I'm not complaining about that. I actually dig it. But still, while it has perhaps made my life harder at times, I have still nonetheless felt like a square peg in a round hole. I have, or you could put it this way, being a misfit comes natural to me, okay? I'm not saying intentionally, like I'm trying to be a misfit. I just am in a lot of different ways. I read a letter back in, it was probably the winter of 2017. Stacy and I were living in Texas. I had no idea what my life was going to look like in the years ahead. I knew what I had lost, but I had no idea what was ahead. And I started to write, and I started to write more and put out there on a blog, just sort of reflections about my own personal collapse, my own crash and burn, and the way God's amazing grace met me in my darkest places. And so I started to get correspondence from people, some people I knew, but most people I didn't know. And this one came from a woman who is now a friend of ours named Robin. She said this: "Your transparency is a gift to the recovery community. I am 2 years clean and sober, and I work with people who are racked with shame daily. There is a stigma to what you're walking through. There is also a stigma to drug addiction, what I went through. We are judged and labeled by those who think their sin is cleaner than ours. And we can't be bitter with them, the judgmental people, because in reality, it is their disdain for us that helps us turn to God again and again. We are not moved by praise or by cutting words. We have found the secret place of the Most High, and by an ironic twist of fate, we now look at our accusers and we feel sorry that they can't be us because we have found true freedom and fulfillment from a well that never runs dry. Have a good day, my friend. We are the lucky ones, the misfits." I love that. I went back. I got that now 5 years ago, and I responded, and we've since become friends with her, and she runs a recovery place now on the west coast of Florida. She struck a nerve with me when she said that she had struggled with drug addiction, something I had never struggled with, neither Stacy or I have ever struggled with any sort of substance abuse issues, but we would still admit that we're in recovery. And I said last week that if you are a human being, you're in recovery. You don't have to be struggling with alcohol abuse or drug abuse, or you don't have to be a sex addict or anything like that to be in recovery. If you are a human being, you are in recovery. If you have been hurt or if you have hurt someone else, you are in recovery. If you are a broken person, which you are, living in a broken world, which you are, with other broken people, which you are in recovery. We are all in recovery. And so it struck a nerve when she said that. It helped me understand that even though my circumstances may be different than hers, in a sense, we understand what it means to lose. We understand regret. We understand failure. We understand all of those things. And so when Stacy and I came here back in 2019 to start the sanctuary, we didn't come here, as I said last week, to start a church for Christians. And we didn't come here to start a church for non-Christians. And we certainly didn't come here to start some kind of religious group. We came to start a recovery place for humans, which is why I say that the sanctuary, and I say this tongue-in-cheek, but it's true, I think, that the sanctuary is a recovery place masquerading as a church. And while there are different recovery groups that meet here during the week, our largest recovery group on a weekly basis meets in here at 10:30 a.m. every Sunday morning. That's who we are. So when I use the word misfit, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people Jesus identified in that verse, the people who are unrighteous and know it, the people who are needy and know it, the people who require mercy and know it. There's a scene in the movie Bohemian Rhapsody. I don't know if you saw it, came out a couple years ago. Great movie. About the band Queen in general, but Freddie Mercury in particular. And there's a scene in that movie where a music industry executive is meeting the band Queen for the first time. At that time, Queen was unknown. They were unsigned. They hadn't signed to a label. No one knew who they were. And there was a music industry executive who wanted to meet with them to see if this may be a band that his company wanted to sign. And so at one point in the conversation, the music executive looks at Freddie Mercury and says, "So tell me, what makes Queen any different from all the other bands I meet?" And his answer, Freddie Mercury's answer in the movie, was worth the price of admission. I have hung on to these words since the moment I heard them spoken in the movies. He said this, "I'll tell you what it is, Mr. Reed. We are four misfits who don't belong together. And we're playing for the other misfits. They are the outcasts at the back of the room, and we are pretty sure they don't belong either. We belong to them." And I remember when he said that, I was like, dang, man, that's me. Really, I love that because that's exactly the way that I feel. Exactly the way that I feel. That's who I am, an outcast who belongs to the other outcasts at the back of the room. I don't belong. You don't belong, we belong to each other. That's so much the way that I feel. Outcasts cast together by the God who seeks out the lost and the guilty and the fearful and the hurting. We are card-carrying members of God's lunatic fringe. We are a bunch of misfits who belong to each other, and more importantly, we belong to a misfit God. Misfit God. I put something about that up on social media last week, and oh my gosh. I mean, I thought it was just a word of encouragement. And the real pious people came at me with guns blazing. I mean, how in the world could you refer to God, almighty, all perfect, all righteous, as a misfit? Now, words mean in context. Which means, if you know anything about literature or various literary genres and how to interpret literature, what that means is that the same word in one context could mean something different in a different context, depending on what that context is. So I was getting lambasted by people simply for calling God a misfit, even though they didn't read what I wrote. One guy said this, and this is my favorite one probably. He said, "Brothers and sisters," now listen, that may be the way you talk, okay? That's not the way I talk. And if you do talk that way, don't talk that way to me. Okay. Brothers and sisters, there's just a pious tone in that alone, you know? Brothers and sisters, God is not a misfit. He's correcting me now in public. God is not, on my social media platform, by the way. Brothers and sisters, God is not a misfit, and to say so is disrespectful of the Almighty who made us. It is shameful. Okay, what do you say when people push back like that? I try to be gentle. I try to be kind. I try to eliminate the murderous thoughts that run through my mind. But my point in calling God a misfit then and in calling God a misfit now is that God doesn't fit in with all the other gods of religion and culture. He doesn't. God isn't like the other gods. He doesn't fit in with all the other gods of religion and culture that demand cleanliness and goodness and achievement in order to be saved. He doesn't fit in with those kind of gods. The gospel of those gods is no gospel at all. In fact, it is an anti-gospel. It's all about works and not grace. It's all about what we can do and not what God has already done. It says that if you want love, you have to make yourself lovely. If you want acceptance, you have to make yourself acceptable. If you want significance, you have to become someone important. We're hearing that all over the place. We hear that in church. We hear that outside of church. We hear it every time we turn on the television. We see it when we drive down the road. We actually tell ourselves those things when we look in the mirror. We're bombarded with the anti-gospel of lesser gods. Bombarded. So in that sense, God doesn't fit in. Uppercase God doesn't fit in with all the lowercase gods. I knew a guy a while back who, older, but he was always, every time I was around him, he was constantly trying to sell his importance to me. He really wanted me. No, he needed me to believe that he was an important person in order for him to feel like an important person. And I've run into lots of people like that. That one stands out in particular. But he, like so many of us, had heard the anti-gospel of the other gods and believed it. In order for me to feel valuable, in order for me to feel important, in order for me to feel significant, and I need other people to think I'm important. I need people to think I'm someone. I need people to think I'm successful. I want them to look at me as a success story. I want them to think that I'm a mover, a shaker, a player. So I've got to constantly jockey for position in order to be saved. That's the anti-gospel of lesser gods. So God isn't like the other gods. He doesn't fit in with them. He's a misfit. In parable after parable in the New Testament, Jesus reveals a God who chooses to love all the wrong people. All the wrong people. He chooses to love the defiant son, not the compliant one. He chooses to love those who broke the Sabbath, not those who kept it. He chooses to love the hungover late day workers, not the diligent all day workers. We see bad people getting rewarded and good people getting rebuked, and everybody's idea of who the winners and losers are is turned upside down. We see that. He's a misfit God. He doesn't do what he's supposed to do. He doesn't act the way he's supposed to act. Jesus was always making the merit mongers mad because he befriended and loved and touched the outcast and the leper and the liar and the cheater and the sexually deviant. Always. He welcomed these people, as we just read, as friends. What made the religious fit-ins so furious was Jesus's derelict habit of loving sinners. They didn't know what to do with that. They hated that. He didn't do what he was supposed to do, go where he was supposed to go, or say what he was supposed to say. In the words of Mike Yaconelli, which is one of my favorite quotes of all time, according to his critics, Jesus did God all wrong. He was supposed to do God differently. He wasn't like the other gods. religious or otherwise. See, grace always provokes those who think they're good. Always. Grace always ruffles the feathers of those who need to believe that they're better. Grace is an enemy of high anthropology. People who need to think that they're better than they are, stronger than they are. Grace is offensive to that kind of person. Grace is offensive to us to the degree that we fall into that trap also. I said last week that Jesus loving and embracing the falsely accused, the victim, and the one who is not guilty, that's not scandalous. In fact, it's expected. I mentioned John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery, and the religious leaders who dragged her out and tried to test Jesus, tried to trick Jesus into saying something that would condemn him. And one of the things that I point out about that story is the fact that the woman was guilty. Okay, she was guilty. They caught her in the act. She was guilty. She was a willful participant in this arrangement, whatever was going on. And so she was guilty as charged. If Jesus had welcomed her, accepted her, was kind to her because she was being falsely accused and she wasn't guilty, well, we expect that. The fact that he welcomed her, loved her, and forgave her because she was guilty, that makes him a misfit God, especially to the Pharisees who dragged her out in front of him. They were trying to say, this is clearly not God because God would never welcome, love, and forgive the guilty. Never. And that's exactly what Jesus did. So what is scandalous is that Jesus loved the criminal caught in the act. Jesus loved the assailant with blood on his hands. Jesus loved the one who reeks of guilt. Filthy, rich Zacchaeus. The woman caught in adultery, even the Roman soldiers casually tossing dice in the shadow of his dying body. Forgive them, Father, they have no idea what they're doing. Who says that? The good news of God's love and forgiveness is not just for those who are bullied and brokenhearted, but to perpetrators themselves. It's not just for the innocent, it's for the guilty, especially for the guilty. It's not just to theoretical sinners, but to actual flesh and blood repeat offenders. You see, what offends us most, and you've heard me say this before, but what offends us most about Jesus is not who he leaves out, it's who he lets in. Okay, that's what tends to be offensive, especially to the religious people, the clean people, the people who need to believe that they're better, which, by the way, is all of us. Okay, the last thing that I want to happen here at the sanctuary is for us to become proud of the fact that we know we're not good. Okay, see the irony in that? And I've encountered this along the way over the course of my career, that I preach this message, and unfortunately what happens, one of the unintended consequences of harping on this message sometimes is that people come to this conclusion. Well, they become a Pharisee to the Pharisees. And what I mean by that is this, that they kind of go, you think you're good. I know I'm bad. That makes me better than you. Okay, see the irony? We want to avoid that like the plague. So when I say Pharisees and religious rule keepers and people who believe anti-gospel, that's all of us at different times throughout the course of a day. Okay, none of us are completely rid of that stuff, and we won't be to the day we die or the day Jesus comes back, whichever comes first. But the good news of God's love and forgiveness is not just for theoretical sinners, but to actual flesh and blood repeat offenders like you and me. The fact that Jesus' heart, that God's heart gravitates toward and embraces the immoral and the criminal and the blamable and the scoundrel and the pariahs of society, that is what makes him such a misfit God. He doesn't fit in with the other gods. So the sanctuary, I could change the mission statement tomorrow. We're in the sanctuary out on the wall where it would say, the sanctuary is a place where a misfit God gathers misfit people. Okay, I won't do that because I would have to wordsmith it a little bit so it's better than what I just said. However, you get the point. I mean, we are a company of misfits, and we are gathered together, assembled together by a misfit God who promises to never leave us or forsake us. You see, grace is not expensive. It's not even cheap. You know, some people will hear a Bible teacher or a preacher talk about grace a lot, and they go, oh, he's just peddling cheap grace. I hate that phrase. Hate that phrase. My friend Steve Brown, who will be here at the end of February for Fallen Free, and you should also, he says, every time I talk about grace, there's always someone who says, cheap grace, he's peddling cheap grace, and Steve's response to that, cheap? I can't even afford cheap. If it's not free, I'm out, which is totally true. So grace itself is not expensive. It's not even cheap. It's free. It's a no strings attached gift of one-way love. But to practice grace the way Jesus did, to love the unlovable, to forgive the unforgivable, to stand with the guilty, to save sinners, well, that may just cost you favor and friends. It might even cost you your life. I know that I have lost friends and acquaintances alike because I have stood with guilty people. And I know people who have lost friends and acquaintances alike because they've stood with me in my guilt. So while grace itself is free, it's a gift of God's one-way love to us. Practicing grace may cost you everything. Robert Capon said this, and this may be what I said Mike Yaconelli's quote a few minutes ago is one of my favorite of all time. This is top five, okay, this one also. Robert Capon said this, I love the way he puts it. Grace is wildly irreligious stuff. It's more than enough to get God kicked out of the God union that the theologians have formed to keep him on his divine toes so that he won't let the riffraff off scot-free. I freaking love that. Okay, I'm going to read it again. Listen, he's just poetic in the way he says it. Grace is wildly irreligious stuff. It's more than enough to get God kicked out of the God union that the theologians have formed to keep him on his divine toes so that he won't let the riffraff off scot-free. He goes on to say, sensible people, of course, should need only about 30 seconds of careful thought to realize that getting off scot-free is the only way any of us is going to get off at all. Geez, that's good, man. Robert Capon, thank you. He's in heaven now, I think. I mean, only God knows, but I'm pretty sure he's there. He's describing a misfit God. A God who not only doesn't fit in with the other gods, a God who doesn't often fit in with our preconceived notions of who God is. That's what he's saying. He's saying, grace is enough to get God kicked out of the God union that scholars and theologians and Bible teachers have carefully crafted in order to keep God on his divine toes, to hold him accountable for not being too gracious to people who don't deserve it. Misfit God. Without question, a misfit God. You know, any approach, and we've talked about this a lot around here, but any approach to life at all that focuses on us and what we need to do to make something of ourselves is what Martin Luther called a theology of glory. Not God's glory, our glory. In fact, a theology of glory isn't about God at all. It's about me. It's not about what God does. It's about what I do. It's about my performance and my potential and my strength and my improvement and my achievements. Its main message is our need to do more and try harder and get better and climb higher and those sorts of things. That's the anti-gospel of a theology of glory. A theology of glory makes our lives all about earning and deserving and getting paid handsomely for a job well done. It has no room for failure. It has no room for weakness. It has really no room for low anthropology, humanness. It's about me. It's about my work, my performance. It's terribly narcissistic, and it's ultimately enslaving. It's ultimately an attempt to make ourselves God. which we're just not big enough to handle that job description. The opposite of the performance-driven theology of glory is what Luther called a theology of the cross. It's the opposite. A theology of the cross is life. A theology of the cross asserts that everything we need has been given to us for free. All of the love, all of the acceptance, all of the approval, all of the justification and significance and security and value and worth that we need in the deepest parts of our being have been delivered to us free of charge by a God of one-way love. A theology of the cross says that we're not defined by our half-assed movements toward goals. We are defined by God's wholehearted movement toward us. A theology of the cross says that we're not defined by our worst moments or our greatest accomplishments, our struggles or our successes, our strengths or our weaknesses. We are defined by who we belong to. That's our identity. Our identity is anchored and tethered to who we belong to. That's who we are at our core. It's not what we do, it's what's been done for us. It's who owns us, who we belong to, who our family is, and who the head of our family is. In other words, it says that our life is not dependent on the strength of our resolve, but rather on the strength of God's resolve for us. So all of this talk and chatter that we find outside and the kind of talk and chatter that we find inside our own minds that are constantly pushing us to do something and to become someone so that we will achieve the kind of status or will achieve the kind of worth or achieve the kind of security that we long for, it's anti-gospel. It's not good news, in other words. That's what the word gospel means, good news. Anti-gospel, essentially, bad news. Because now it's all riding on you. It's all up to you. You have to do it. It's about you. And while that may seem empowering at first, it's actually incredibly enslaving. Incredibly enslaving, as we know. So, in other words, what keeps us connected to God is not that we hold tightly to Him. That's not what keeps us connected to God. What keeps us connected to God is that He holds tightly to us even when we let go, especially when we let go. We are safe and sound in His boundless love because of His faithfulness, not ours, because of His work, not ours, because of His performance and obedience, not ours. And that's great news. That's actually gospel because a religion of human goodness and potential and strength is exposed for the unhelpfulness that it is when everything falls apart. This idea that you can do this and you can become all of that sort of that religion, that anti-gospel of human strength and human potential and all of that stuff, falls flat when life falls apart. All of that stuff falls flat when life comes unraveled. It's never easy to admit our failures and our flaws. It's never fun to do it. I've said for years now that standing up in front of people, in front of groups of people, or writing for public consumption and admitting, confessing that my first marriage ended in part because I was unfaithful to my first wife, saying that stuff sucks, okay? It's embarrassing. I never get used to it. It's not fun. It's not fun confessing my sin to myself. It's certainly not fun confessing my sin to other people. Some may take it and use it against me. I don't know. But I haven't yet come up with a better way to showcase God's amazing goodness without telling you about some of my badness. I don't know how to do it. In fact, I think that's probably the most effective way for people to see that Jesus is in fact a friend of sinners. Okay? Otherwise, if we never do that, the people walk away concluding, well, Jesus only loves the good, clean people who have their lives together. Unless we get up and start confessing and admitting that we don't have our lives together, that's when people will start thinking, wow, Jesus really is a friend of sinners. And the verses that we read a few minutes ago, people will actually go, I know what that means now. I get it. So it's never easy to admit our failures and flaws. It's never fun to confess our sins and struggles. It's hard to share our secrets. It's hard to talk about our insecurities. It's never fun. In a world that values strength, it's tough to acknowledge weakness. I mean, telling the truth about ourselves is scary. So what do? We edit our profiles, we wear masks, we hide the ugly parts of ourselves. We lie to ourselves and we lie about ourselves, all because we are terrified that if people really knew us, they wouldn't love us. And so we Photoshop our lives and we edit our browser histories. It's all metaphor now, okay? We lie to ourselves and we lie about ourselves, all because we are just terrified that if people really knew us, if people knew the truth about us, they'd run for the hills. And some of them actually would, and some of them will. Some of them have, as you know. See, that's the beauty of a theology of the cross. It's practical, it's punchy in this way, it's liberating. Because it sets you free to talk truthfully about yourself without fear, because the only person's approval you need is God's, and you already have it. The only person whose love you actually need is God's, and you already have it. You can now endure rejection from others because you'll never have to endure rejection from God. So I can tell the truth about myself, and if you walk away from me, or if you use it against me, or if I am now persona non grata in your world, I'll be okay. I'll be okay because I will never be persona non grata in God's world, ever. And it's that unconditional love that grounds me and gives us the backbone to tell the truth about ourselves, to be honest. See, those who are the most free are those who have the least fear telling the truth about themselves. And those who have the least fear telling the truth about themselves are those who know how unconditionally loved they are by God. And when you know that you are gripped by a love that will never let you go, ever, that you are gripped by an unlosable lover, when you know that, oh man, it solidifies you and it gives you the strength and it gives you the courage even to be honest about yourself, to yourself first. And then to others. I'm not talking here about being indiscriminately open where you're just throwing up on everybody because you think you're free. I'm not talking about that. No one likes to be thrown up on, all right? I'm not talking about that. So if you go, well, I'm just putting into practice what Pastor Tullian said, so sit down and listen. I'm going to tell you every dirty, dark secret. Just settle down, okay? Rein it in, all right? Slow your roll. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that we are now free to tell the truth about ourselves without fear. It doesn't mean we will always just tell everybody everything. It's that when we need to tell the truth about ourselves, we're free to do so because we will never lose God's love for us, even if we lose the love of the person that we're telling. So those who are the most free are those who have the least fear telling the truth about themselves, and those who have the least fear telling the truth about themselves are those who know just how unconditionally loved they are by God. Let me just conclude with this. I would have preached longer, but I talked so much about the Cowboys before that I have to shorten my sermon. Sorry, God. The good news of Christianity rings true when we are finally able to admit that we are weak and that we need help. Before that, it's just kind of it's a religion. It's a tool to better ourselves. It's a religious status symbol. Christianity doesn't really land until the heart is desperate. And the good news, the truth of Christianity, the good news of Christianity finally rings true when we are able to admit that we are weak and that we need help, that we fail, that we're not as put together as we want people to think we are. That's when it becomes good news to us. That's when it feels liberating to us. That's when the rushing wind of God's amazing grace blows through and reminds us of how beloved we are no matter what. No matter what. Any other God would have given up on us a long time ago. One and done. But our God is the deity category killer. His love never ceases. The psalmist tells us his love never ceases, never ends. Unlike all the other gods, our God indiscriminately accepts us, the repetitious screw-ups that we are, again and again and again and again. Again, and when I say repetitious screw-ups, I'm not talking about people who really blow it big. I'm talking about you and me every day in the smallest and most subtle of ways. Every thought, word, or deed that is less than perfect according to God's standard of perfection makes us a repetitious screw-up. We are either perfect or we're not. And since perfection is the only thing God requires, thankfully, Jesus was perfect for us, so he accepts us fully and finally because of what he has done on our behalf. But as far as us in and of ourselves, repetitious screw-ups. And being able to finally admit that, whatever inside of you or inside of me goes, I don't like saying that about myself. That's evidence that you're believing the anti-gospel of lesser gods. That you're still in some way holding on to this idea that, no, I have to think of myself in a certain way in order for me to feel stable and important and valuable. Get rid of all that stuff. Just jump off the performance treadmill and throw it in the garbage. Life begins to feel so much lighter and more free when you believe the true gospel rather than the anti-gospel. So unlike all the other gods, our God indiscriminately accepts us again and again and again. He is a misfit God. He's the shepherd constantly searching, the woman desperately looking high and low, the hope-filled father running with outstretched arms crying, welcome home, welcome home, welcome home, over and over and over again. Over and over again. You won't find that in anyone or in anything else. Grace, always grace. Eugene Peterson used to sign his handwritten letters, grace, always grace, no matter what the letter said. And I love that. Grace, always grace. When I think about the people in my life who have had the biggest impact on me, grace is their secret power, their superpower, the secret sauce that attracted me to them. My dad stands out, as you've heard me say, probably as the one who embodied grace more for me in my life than any other person. He died back in 2010, January of 2010. I was still, relatively young back then, early, mid-30s, I guess I was, mid-late 30s. And he was not only one of my best friends, but my chief counselor and advisor. I didn't make any decision, big or small, without consulting my dad. He was not only the embodiment of wisdom, but he was absolutely the embodiment of grace. Grace. Grace, it's attractive. The more gracious we are with other people, the more attracted they are to the God of grace. And how can we be anything but gracious when all we've been given since the moment we were conceived is grace from God? So we are misfits, yes we are, and thankfully we are gathered together by a misfit God, standing my ground, a misfit God, and thank God he's a misfit God. Thank God he's unlike all the other gods that constantly dangle carrots in front of us and say, run faster. Thank God our God just welcomes us with open arms in all of our dirt and guiltiness and says, you're mine. Let's pray together.